My mom, as far back as I can remember, did not work because she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. I learned later in life she had been a victim of sexual abuse and child abuse as a child. She had been diagnosed with depression, but then she had met my father, who was an angry and abusive alcoholic. So he would start weaponizing her mental health against her whenever she reached out to the authorities. And my mom's diagnosis of depression became one of paranoid schizophrenia. Every time law enforcement would come, whenever there was a domestic violence episode, my father would parade the medication she was on in front of law enforcement. They would believe my mom was delusional and they would place her in a mental institution. I would learn later in life that my mom went to a battered spouse's shelter at least 3 times and she was institutionalized 13 different times. My father also was a victim of abuse and self-reported sexual abuse. He also was in a mental institution on more than one occasion. However, the mental health aspect of it was never picked up on by the authorities. So whenever the authorities would come, they would basically take the side of my father, who was a very articulate individual, while my mom was disheveled and very upset because of all the abuse going on, and my father's story would prevail time and time again. I would later learn that my father was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. That led to a lot of the physical violence in the house because we failed to meet his OCD standards. However, because he was drunk all the time, he was very violent, and so he would quite literally beat us for failing to obtain these unattainable goals. In the 2nd grade, I won an award for writing a children's book, and I remember my father taking both the award and the book and throwing them away. And so I soon learned that anything that I did that was good was taken away from me, and all that remained that was bad. But then the punishment started to become physical in nature. I started getting marks and whelps and bruises on me, and they were identified at school. And so we would get these concerned phone calls home where teacher was inquiring as to how I got these marks. However, there was no provision of treatment or services. So all they were doing was notifying my father that these were red flags and they shouldn't see these things. But nothing was done to change the circumstances underneath. And so what started happening is my abuse started to become more warped, more hidden, more obscured. I also began to start lying. I realized that what happens at home, stays at home, and domestic violence, child abuse is a family business. The punishments that I got, a lot of them were being punched in the face. I had lots of black eyes. I had a lot of marks and whelps from being beat with various things. Obviously, belts hurt. Extension cords hurt more, but I hated belt buckles the worst because not only did you have the whelps and the sting from being struck, my father was also very fond of strangling. But he used to hold me in the air and he used to strangle me. And I remember getting in trouble if I tried to fight back. Couldn't touch his hands or anything. I just had to sit there and tape it. And I remember just staring into his blue eyes, trying to determine on each occasion if that was the last day, if that was the day that he was going to put me down like a dog. I remember eventually he would throw me down on the ground and I'd be dizzy and disoriented. Honestly, a lot of times it just didn't even register. Everything kind of becomes surreal and it's like an outer body experience. But it was just a normal part of my childhood. And it was generally because I failed to do something properly. And nothing I could do was ever right because he had these OCD requirements, but he was an angry and abusive alcoholic. There was a cycle about every 6 months where my mom would try to run away. So when my mom would run away, song and dance for the law enforcement, he would demonstrate the meds my mom was on, and she would be placed in a mental institution. And they would generally hold her there 30, 40 days until she recanted and said everything was in her head, which only served to reinforce the narrative because the subsequent time he would say what happened last. As time progressed, they continued to increase my mom's medication like higher and higher as far as the dosages, which also had negative side effects for my mom. Parallel to this, my father liked to have sex. And he would have sex with my older sister. And I actually learned about this because of all the abuse and everything going on at home. I had trouble going to sleep at night. Oftentimes I would bang my head on a pillow until I just was exhausted and I would fall out. My sisters, who I shared a room with, didn't like this and they would tell on me so I would get in trouble. What I started doing is I would wait up late at night until I thought my sisters were asleep, and then I would bang my head. I learned later in life this is just a coping mechanism, a modality people use for extreme abuse and sexual abuse, violence and stuff like this. But as a child, I just thought there was something wrong with me and I was just flawed. But it was through that process of waiting till my sisters went to sleep that I realized that my father would come into the bedroom and he would have sex with my older sister. Sometimes he would actually displace me from my bed. He would sit in the bed, he would, and then I'd wait for all this to transpire, and then I would go to bed. And it was just something normal. It was a normal part of life. And to a certain extent, I didn't even know it was wrong. When it came to the physical abuse, I knew it was wrong because I was told to lie about it. And lying is bad. But we didn't talk about the sexual abuse stuff. And even in going into school, it's not like the sex education courses kids get in elementary school, the teacher is saying your parents shouldn't be having sex with you. So we're not talking about it. We're not lying about it. No one is telling us. There was investigation by social services early on. And I grew up in California, so it was Child Protective Services. I remember at one point in time, they thought I might be gifted, and they sent me off for testing. Apparently I wasn't, because then they tried to put me on Ritalin. And I never wanted to take medication because I saw what happened with my mom. So fortunate for me, I guess, there was never any follow-up. So once the bottle of pills were emptied, there was no renewal or anything like that. But outside of that, most of the time, social services would come and they would take notes. They often questioned me in front of my father, and then they would go away. I learned really quick that I needed to say exactly what my father said. Otherwise, if things were bad before they came, it would be far worse afterwards. In fact, as a child, I would often try to convince my father when we learned someone was coming that I can make social services go away. And oftentimes I would come up with my own story to make them go away. So I would do things like my black eye happened because I tripped and fell and hit a doorknob. But I would really sell it. Like, I would run down the hallway and act like I tripped and fell and I hit my eyeball on the doorknob. Or my sister beat me up, or the cat did it, to explain some of the whelps from extension cords and stuff. But none of those things were true. They would never ask follow-up questions. They would never dig deeper into what was going on, and they would always accept those superficial lies. So there's one instance where they acknowledged that I had a black eye, and I denied the abuse. My sister corroborated it. My father denied the abuse. And so the case was closed. The children are healthy and cared for. Well, you still have a child with a black eye. So you still have a child that's not safe, let alone the fact that it was all a lie. It was my father that was causing it. And this continued to happen, and the pattern of violence continued to escalate. Something that I need to point out too is that a lot of times when people are in these situations, myself included, will do things that we're not proud of. There are many times where I would try to manipulate the situation to prevent harm from coming to me. My mother, although she was victimized by domestic violence and all the other stuff that comes with it, she herself committed acts against me. I don't blame her because I feel she was a product of the situation, but she gave me one of the worst beatings I ever had. She put me, I was probably in about 4th grade, and my mom put me in a black sleeping bag. And I remember the hardest part with my mom is the hope. I thought maybe I can convince her to not do this punishment, because she didn't beat me in a very angry and chaotic state like my father did. My father was very explosive. He would just attack you and then you're in shock. But my mom, it would be much more planned. And I remember I had spilled some soda on the table, and my father got angry. He grabbed me, he threw me up against the ceiling, so I crashed against the ceiling, and then I fell to the ground. And then my mom came and grabbed me, and she was going to go ahead and punish me. And I felt it was to put guardrails on the amount of harm that I would receive. But she was very effective at punishing me as well. It was that whole OCD thing going on. So she put me in this sleeping bag. And I remember trying to plead and beg with her, I'll never drink soda again. I'll never spill anything again. Please don't do this. But she put me in the sleeping bag. She put me all the way in so I couldn't see. My head all the way enclosed and zipped it up. She grabbed the wooden pole that you hang your clothes on in the closet on. And she started beating me with the wooden pole. And I remember the hard part is that when she hits high, you block high. Well, then she'd hit low, and then you block low. You would quickly learn to just block high and take the rest of your blows to your body. And I remember some of the worst lumps were like the ones on my face and stuff. It took so long to heal. It's one of the reasons why I often didn't start school on time, is because I was always healing for something. Whenever there were winter breaks, whenever there were summer breaks, there was no reprieve because they could do whatever, and I had plenty of time to heal. So those were some of the most dangerous times for me. I have 2 siblings, and their story is theirs to share. But on at least 2 occasions, my mom actually dressed up my older sister and presented my sister to my father. And I think in those moments, she was making a calculated decision as to whether or not she wanted to be in a mental institution, because, you know, at least with the shelters, I've gone with her to some of those places, and they were scary to me as a child and very dangerous and very traumatizing. So imagine being put in a mental institution and being told you're delusional because you think your husband is trying to kill you, or you think your husband is having sex with your daughter, when these things are actually happening. And it was my father that would call the authorities on you. So you really do feel as if you're trapped and there's nothing you could do. There's no need to have any lock on the door. Nevertheless, my mom did try to run away often. In the summer of 1998, my mom tried to run away, and she was out in the cul-de-sac in our apartment that we were residing. And my father devised an idea to grab a hammer and scare her inside. So he is using a hammer to cause apprehension in my mother to scare her to come back inside. He hits my mom in the head with a hammer. The ambulance comes. I convince my father to let me go with mom to make sure that she doesn't say anything. And I go with her to UC Davis Medical Center. Again, this is the summer of 1998. And I remember wandering around the hospital complex, and I found myself on the edge of a 5-story parking garage at UC Davis Medical Center. And I really thought about jumping. Because at that point, there was nothing good in it. There was no point in living. It was not worth waking up every day. And so I was on this parking garage and I just thought about jumping, but knowing my luck, I would probably survive. And so I didn't jump. But ever since that day, suicidal ideations has been a lifelong companion of mine. But I went back in the medical facility, and I remember there was this person that worked there, and I don't know if they were a doctor, a nurse practitioner, or what, but they saw me alone wandering, and they brought me to the cafeteria. They sat me down, they bought me a chicken sandwich and on the meal, and just asked me normal questions about like a child, like a kid. And in that moment, I realized the world wasn't just this horrible place I was living in, and there was some good. I always wish I could go back and find that person and thank them because of the impact they had. It's such a small thing. I mean, I remember it to this day. And it's one of the reasons why I push to try to bring good to life, to try to use my past for something positive. As far as my mom, once they treated her for getting hit in the head with a hammer, they fixed her stitches. They put her back in a mental institution because of her delusional episode, because she was going crazy and my father was trying to help her. In the Child Protective Services record, they got interviews from myself and my siblings. They identified that we were lying, that we were parentified, that we were trying to protect our father. However, they declined to open up a case or pursue it further because we didn't want any assistance. The district attorney declined to press charges because he didn't want us kids to go into care. It was the last opportunity to intervene before my father ultimately killed my mom. The medication my mom was getting at that point was so high, there would be a nurse practitioner that came to our house weekly to give her injections because she kept having these delusional episodes where she believed her husband was trying to kill her or if her husband was having sex with her daughter. But after the hammer incident, the medical services were afraid to come to our apartment to issue her those shots. It was that bad. My father would call the institutions my mom would go to or the shelter that she was hiding at and would threaten staff. So staff were deathly afraid of my father. No one would come to the house to provide my mom with medications, but no one was taking us out of the situation. And I think it was December 4th or 5th of 1998, my mom tried to run away again. She went into the bedroom. She tried to make it out of the bedroom window, and my father didn't let her. He grabbed her, he threw her on the ground. He instructed myself and my siblings to go get belts and socks and stuff so he can tie up my mother. When he tied her up this time, she was laying flat on her stomach. He tied her in a hog-tied position, and he stood on the back of her head. He jumped up and down, and he spat on her. And I'll never forget that because that was the night that she perished. The next day, my mom was discovered deceased, and my father had tied her, but her body was still in that same position. And he actually thought about everybody committing suicide. But in retrospect, it probably would have been 3 more homicides and a suicide. He thought he was going to get arrested. So we had a cat at the time. He took the cat to a next door neighbor, and we went to the fire department. The fire department came, my mom was untied. But they carried her out in that same hog-tied position. And as a child, I learned what rigor mortis is. They carried her out. Her face was smashed and bloodied. Her clothes were soiled. And then we went to school the next Monday because my father was not arrested. Nothing changed. It was seen as an unfortunate event where my mom was having yet another mental health episode. And my wonderful father was trying to protect her and take care of us kids. That's when things really started to get back. I know for me personally, I can somewhat deal with the physical abuse as I failed to meet his standards. I didn't do something good enough, and so I deserve the punishment. In the sort of a unhealthy way, I can rationalize the physical abuse. But my father also sexually abused me. And that is one of the things that is the most difficult to process or to deal with, because it has nothing to do with what I did or didn't do. It is him literally seeing me as a child as not being human, some sort of object for his gratification. And had we stayed there much longer, I would have taken a chance on suicide. Fortunately for me, my older sister beat me to that thought process. She tried to kill my father. unsuccessfully. She broke his foot, but she wasn't able to kill him. So then she tried to kill herself. She tried to hang herself in the closet by a belt. My father tried to get the belt from around her neck and couldn't, so he called 911. Prior to them coming, he was able to get the belt off, and so he tried to cancel the call, but they still came. They removed my older sister, and they placed her in a mental institution. After she was there for a few days, she had disclosed the sexual abuse. After that disclosure, then they finally took my other two siblings from that situation, and then we're all placed in different places. We were separated from one another. My older sister went in a group home. I went in a group home as an emergency placement, which I would stay in for 2.5 years. And my younger sister went to a foster home with, unfortunately, a foster mom that wasn't the best, took advantage of her, used her social security number to buy things with her credit and stuff. And we all had negative experiences once we're in the system. And that was our starting point for life. But my father, it's in my records that when they brought him in to ask about the sexual abuse allegations, he acknowledged everything and provided details. He had been sexually abusing my older sister for at least 5 years. She had been giving them oral sex. He provided all these details. They thanked him for his time. This was law enforcement. And then they let him go. It wasn't until a week later that they finally filed charges for sexual abuse. Father was indicted for 56 counts of molesting my older sister. He pled guilty to 10. Initially, he was sentenced to 30 years, and he ultimately got out after 17 or 18 years after serving on good behavior. He was never charged with the homicide of my mom. The reason the district attorney gave for not pursuing homicide charges against my father was that the office was unaware that there was a history of domestic violence and child abuse. That's the actual documentation. And then a few years later, there's a document that shows that all the records were destroyed. So homicide is one that you can always charge, but now they can't because they've destroyed the records. The biggest issue that I see looking back over the lack of investigations or the mistakes made in interpreting what they found when they investigated was a lack of communication, a lack of connection. There was a failure to connect the facts to the law. There was a failure to connect the dots of all the various calls. There was a failure of agencies to connect to one another. One of the biggest sources of the abuse and neglect that was happening in my house was my school, but there was no connection there. There was no communication. There was no communication within social services in and of itself to see all the extent of history. Every time it feels that someone new would come out, they would look at the situation as being isolated, and no one was looking at the bigger picture. No one was looking at the inconsistent statements that were made. They were taking at face value the statements they were receiving, and there was no digging deeper to see if this was the truth. So the district attorney, when they declined to press charges, and they said in their own record, we didn't know there's a history of domestic violence. That just shows me. I mean, I worked for an internal prosecutor's office, and they're slammed with cases as well. And so they didn't have the time to do a thorough record check within their own agency, let alone calling the school and calling Child Protective Services or EMS that came to our house for. He took a deadly weapon and intention. This, by his statements, wanted to cause apprehension to his wife. That's domestic violence, right? I used a weapon. I'm trying to scare my spouse with a weapon. That, by his statements alone. And then take a step back. He actually struck her in the head with a hammer. Did not press charges. And that was the last time before time. What more documentation? After my father killed my mom, they went in and conducted an interview of the apartment complex. And the apartment manager said that what they were saying in the unit is that he finally did it. He finally killed her. So for the people in the apartment complex to make those statements, what information was available in advance that could have prevented that homicide? Worse still, is that one of the managers was putting up signs in the apartment complex. Doug has unprotected sex with his stepdaughter. Someone call CPS. Like, actually wrote that. Did not call CPS himself, but put up posters in apartment complex talking. And for those details, unprotected sex. It just shows you that information was available if we had the resources to gather. But the inability to do so caused our living situation to continue to get worse and worse. Sexual abuse, physical violence, including homicide, and that still wasn't enough for us to come into here. Hey, and I want to make sure it comes across that I don't blame Child Protective Services or law enforcement. I don't, because it's a systemic issue, and I think we as a society need to do more to step up. You hear it said often, be the change you want to see. I don't wish my childhood on anyone. It was a horrible experience, and I'm fortunate to have the life that I have. So I really do feel like it's my duty to speak up for those who cannot, to use my experiences to prevent others from having harm. I really would not change anything in my past, despite everything, because I love the life I have. I am blessed to have my wife and my 3 children. And because I'm so fortunate, I try to give back and I try to right the wrongs. I use myself as a living case and sample because it's my obligation.